Hello from the Open World Forum 2010, and I'm here now with David Bollier, author and Commons scholar, and John Wilbanks from the Creative Commons movement, the Creative Commons Foundation? Organization. So let's start off by saying, what is a commons? What do you mean by a commons in terms of the knowledge economy?
Well, a commons is essentially a community of people who've self-organized themselves and decided to manage their knowledge resource, be it software code or journal articles, in a way for the benefit of the community. And they devise certain mechanisms to allow them to do that, be they legal licenses, sometimes government support and policies, sometimes their own social norms among themselves that we are going to share this and make it available. And that's a source of value that sometimes is different from what the market can produce.
And it's important to know that this idea of the commons comes originally from commonly held physical resources, things like common grass, air, and water. And in many cases, most of the people who are watching this will have heard of The Tragedy of the Commons, which was a paper written in 1968, which was outlining the way that commonly held physical resources might be overused and therefore overconsumed to the point that they no longer exist at all for the common good. And this was the idea of a tragedy of the commons. And what's different in the context of a digital commons is that these goods tend to be not rivalrous. If I have a data set and you have a copy of the data set, neither one of us gets hurt by that. And the software as a commons is a good example of this. You have these things in lots of cultural works. And the idea of these scalable commons-based resources is really starting to come back against this idea of the tragedy as the only way to think of a commonly held resource.
Of course, following on from that, the idea of a virtual commons of virtual goods, of knowledge goods, requires the donation of a goods to create the commons initially. How do you go about, particularly in the Creative Commons movement, how do you go about convincing owners of finally private goods, how do you convince them that it's worthwhile for them to donate those goods to a commons and create something which is going to be enriched by a community afterwards?
It really depends on the kind of commons you're creating. So in the context of Creative Commons tools, the vast majority of what owners and users create is under what we call a some rights reserved regime. So I'm willing to license some of my rights to you, but I'm going to require certain conditions that you comply with as part of that. So I might require that you give me credit through attribution. I might require that you not resell it, that only I retain the right to sell the work. I might require that you share your derivative works the same way that I shared mine. So it's not so much about a donation as it is about a social contract that says, I'm willing to let you use my works, but you're going to have to behave a certain way back in return. And that, I think, creates a broader set of incentives than simply asking people to give something away for free. And the other aspect is that part of a commons is that a commons is also a network of rights. So it's not just that you have a network of bits or a network of documents, it's that you have a network of offers among and between people that begins to bind them in a way. And that sort of connection between the owner and the user is actually also a really important reason to participate.
Well, one reason that people share or donate is because on the network, on open platforms on networks, there's often greater value created by giving it away than by holding it exclusive. A friend of mine once quipped, sort of on a riff on Oscar Wilde, the only thing worse than being sampled on the internet is not being sampled. The idea being that by giving it away, or at least making it available under certain limited ways, the way John just described, one can get more value for oneself than holding it tight.
So David, you wrote a book some years ago called Viral Spiral.
Yes, it's a history of the rise of free software, the rise of invention of the Creative Commons licenses, and a lot of follow-up
which also
innovations.
describes, if I understand correctly, the evolution that you expect to see happen in the coming years in the creation of new commonses and the creation of new areas where collaboration and sharing happens?
Well, it's already happening in that these software code and licenses are a kind of infrastructure. They're tools for building new sorts of commons, and it's directly given rise to such things as open access publishing that academics do. John's talked about open data sets. There's open science and open business models. Many of these use these tools to build the commons, and so it's what I call a viral spiral, where it's progressing upward in ways we don't quite know and frankly can't predict.
So you both participated in a workshop over the last couple of days. Are there any conclusions that you've come away with from the workshop in terms of what is the status of software as a commons, of the knowledge economy, and the effect of considering that as a commons?
I think a lot of people in the free and open source software world have understood themselves as a commons, but maybe haven't considered how they're part of a larger ecosystem of commonses, and that the software is in fact related to many of these academic commonses or data commonses, or indeed a lot of movements in the physical world to create commons. There's, for example, open source hardware production, where people are creating cars and refrigerators using open design collaboration. So there's an interesting centrifugal energy going on based on these tools, which I think is one of the fascinating insights that we've learned here.
And just to follow on from that, I think what I've taken away is that so many of these movements, like David talked about, really draw inspiration from the software world. But I don't know that there's a robust channel of knowledge transfer between software and these other movements, both so that these other movements can learn the lessons that software has already learned the hard way about things like proliferating lots of legal tools that don't work together, and for some of the things that are being learned in these other movements to come back to software. The open hardware movement is a great example. These open source cars, we have all these questions about how are they going to deal with safety? And bringing that back into the open source software movement, being able to understand from open source software, well, how is it being used in security? And how can that bring information back over to open source cars? How can what we learn about open source pharmaceutical discovery come back and influence the way we do open source software development? And I think what I learned at this event is that channel needs to be probably more formal, and it certainly needs to be more robust than it currently is, because there's a lot of knowledge being duplicated unnecessarily right now.
There's also a keen interest in trying to get a better theoretical grip on how you govern a commons. There isn't really even a taxonomy yet. There's a lot of great case examples. So I think there's a lot of searching for what are some recurrent patterns or design principles of successful digital commons.
On that subject, one of the issues that faces a lot of software commons in particular is that you need to fund it. So often what happens is you will get vendors coming along, and it's not actually a commons, it's one vendor who's controlling the product. So is there a case for saying that software, free software, is a public service, is a public good, and should therefore be funded by public funding? And how do you go about convincing governments that that's something that's worth doing?
Well, there's one of my favorite quotes is that open source is not a verb, right? So too often you'll hear, well, we'll open source that, which simply means to make it available under an open license, as opposed to understanding that open sourcing is an ecosystem. It's the users, it's the software, it's the licenses, it's the authors, it's all of that. And so in an ideal case, when we think of open source, that's what we think of. We think of these robust, self-sustaining ecosystems. But I think in critical areas, there's a real argument for the public good aspect of government funding in open source. And I certainly think that typically when we're going to invest taxpayer dollars, whatever government we're part of, that there's a greater return on investment if the output of public funding is a public good. But the creation of public goods under public licenses does not guarantee that we get that thing we think of when we think of open source. That only comes when you have the users and the authors acting together to create new tools, as opposed to simply maintaining one resource under a public system. But I think there's a really clear argument to be made that if it's taxpayer funded, that taxpayers should have the access to make changes to it and to use that.
So thank you very much, David and John. I think we've had a nice overview there of how the knowledge economy relates to the theory of commons, management of the commons. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
And goodbye from the Open World Forum 2010, and see you soon on Intelli'N TV.